Let's get a bit more on this now and speak to Jamie Shea, who's the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges. Thanks ever so much for coming on the show. Let's start with the communique. Much tougher language than we've had in the past. As far as you're concerned, any surprises?
No surprises. And let me also start by thanking you for having me on the show today. No surprises, because we know since the last NATO summit in London in December 2019 that China is now on NATO's agenda. And so obviously, given that now we've had the best part of 18 months until this latest summit, NATO has had lots of time to start looking at China, analysing China, assessing China in all of its many aspects. And we know in that time, more generally, the West, and you saw this at the G7, has become more aware of what everybody calls the challenge of China, the economic challenge, the technology challenge, the challenge in the influence in the developing countries that we've seen over the COVID-19 vaccine, the challenge of values, which system delivers the goods best. So NATO has had 18 months to get its ducks in a row to look at China. And I think the communique sort of reflects this more sort of thorough, in-depth analysis. That said, we need to interpret what the NATO declaration says in its broadest aspects. NATO doesn't call China an enemy or an adversary. It doesn't mention the word rival that you've seen elsewhere. It does talk about, obviously, challenge and competition, but it makes clear that we don't want to sort of have with China a replay of the very frustrating Cold War that we had with the Soviet Union over 4 decades. It's not that. And NATO also makes clear that cooperation with China on global challenges is a key part of the story. So obviously the Allies have spent a long time negotiating all of this. It wasn't done overnight. And it represents, I think, a balanced approach on a broad front. And we therefore need to look at the positive side and not just zoom in on the notion of some kind of rivalry or some kind of growing competition.
So much more attention then on China. What about Russia?
Well, Russia, I think, is still seen by NATO as the #1 challenge. I have to be clear on that. It's not as if NATO is suddenly sort of dropping Russia and saying that doesn't matter any longer. Let's all now, turn the camera around and zoom in on China. It's not that at all. Russia is by far the biggest challenge because it's immediately on NATO's borders in a way that China clearly isn't. Russia has been flexing its muscles on the border with Ukraine recently, in the Black Sea, in the Arctic. It's been modernising and building up its forces close to NATO's borders. And as we know, there's no real secret here. It's been carrying out a number of so-called hybrid warfare attacks, cyber attacks, as recently in the United States, against many NATO allies. It's been using things like chemical weapons here in the United Kingdom. So all of these things come together, I think, to make NATO much more focused short-term on the challenge from Russia. But China is seen over the course of the 21st century much more as a long-term challenge, because obviously it's a much more powerful country and will be a much more powerful country, a much more influential country on the international scene in the long run than Russia.
So China long-term, the focus short-term, Russia. But the military alliance has really made it clear it wants to engage in issues like climate change, like funding. So does this new business mean that the old business goes away?
No, unfortunately not. It would be great, wouldn't it, once again, if you could sort of drop a load of issues simply because some more interesting things suddenly come around the corner. But that's not the case. It's good that NATO obviously is waking up to the challenge of climate change. It's not exactly new because climate change has been a security headache now for at least 2 decades. All that's happening is the evidence for that has been mounting. And so rather belatedly, NATO is grappling with that issue. But the old business, which your correspondent just a moment ago mentioned, transatlantic burden sharing, the Europeans taking more responsibility, sorting out the problems in the neighbourhood, particularly in the Middle East, how to deal with Afghanistan, which is going to remain a major challenge, even if NATO is now pulling out its forces, looking at how Turkey can come closer to NATO than maybe it has been recently, the Balkans. So no, unfortunately, NATO is an organisation which now really has to walk and chew gum at the same time, if I can use a well-known American expression.
Well, I'd love to keep talking to you, but alas, the clock is ticking. Jamie Shea, an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you.